Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this staatskantine. Today, we're going to be talking about our fiscal future with our guest, Dr. Marc Robinson, whom I will have the pleasure of introducing in a moment. I see a number of familiar faces in this audience, but for those who are new, my name is Alenka. I am a co-founder and co-director of Staatslabor, the Swiss government innovation lab. I'm here today with my wonderful colleagues. We have Krista, Medea, Samira, Jana, Dani, and Dario, if you might all wave. Thank you very much. And when we're not bringing together experts and change makers in government, just like today, we work directly with government entities on innovation projects of all kinds. If this is something that might be of interest, please do not hesitate to get in touch. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Marc Robinson. Marc, your new book, Bigger Government, has been recognized by the FT as one of the best economics books of 2020. Described as, I quote, quantitative, meticulous, and sobering. So I, of course, got my copy. And then doing some research, I realized that although you have, as an internationally renowned expert in public expenditure, advised more than 30 countries on budgeting reforms, worked as a civil servant and a professor of economics in Australia, and as staff economist at the IMF in Washington, you're now based in Switzerland, not far away at all from where I grew up in the Canton de Vaud. So it was a bit of an extra something. The view over the Lac Léman being an innovation to see and think ahead, your book is about the future of public spending and advanced economies over the time horizon of the next 30 years. A central point is that independently of philosophical preferences about the scope of the welfare state or about the appropriate role of government, we will be spending more whether we like it or not. Health, climate change, and long-term care will be the main area where spending will rise, sometimes also infrastructure and pension. Some optimists consider that the aggressive adoption of new generation digital technology, AI, robots, you name it, will be able to mitigate those costs or even save us money. You tend to disagree. We are hopefully entering a phase of recovery from a major crisis, and debates on the level of public spending are likely to intensify quite soon, also here in Switzerland. We have seen that important debates aren't always based on solid research, but we will nevertheless continue to invite great minds capable of showing the way. Marc, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alenka. It's really a great pleasure to join Staatslabor, the Staatskantine, today. Il faut dire, il n'y a pas vraiment de vue dans cette partie de la Suisse aujourd'hui, mais bon, the weather is probably equally bad in Bern today. But look, it really is a great pleasure because, as you mentioned, I tend to work all around the world, and this book is certainly about the prospects facing advanced countries in general, but I don't really get the chance to discuss this or put it in a Swiss context very much, and that I think is going to be the great thing about the discussion today. So what I want to do is to, as you've said, speak briefly to give people a feeling for the overall thrust of the book, the key elements. It's quite a long book. There's a lot of detail and so on, but an overview of the book and therefore set the scene for what I'm sure is going to be a very fruitful discussion. So the basic theme of the book is that we're heading to a new era of substantially bigger government. The perspective of the book, as was mentioned, is the next 30 years. And the argument in the book is that governments in all advanced countries are facing very large long-term spending pressures, particularly in the areas of health, climate change, and long-term care. And that what these concretely are going to lead to is additional spending of at least 7% of GDP everywhere by the middle of the century. We can put that in context. In Switzerland, government expenditure, all levels of government combined before the pandemic was about 32% of GDP. So you can see 7% extra is a lot. Now, everyone is saying over recent times that we're heading to an era of bigger government. So what exactly is different about the theme that's advanced in my book? Well, I think there are two key things here. The first is that what I'm arguing here has got very little to do with the pandemic. The trends I'm talking about would have happened even if the pandemic had never been there, and the extra contribution of the pandemic will be very small indeed. You know, if we think about it, nearly all of the extra government spending that's taken place in response to the pandemic since March 2020 has been temporary in nature to support businesses and citizens. The long-term extra spending, which will be essentially in the area of strengthening health systems to make them more robust in the face of potential future pandemics, that's actually going to be quite small. And really, the long-term effect of the pandemic is actually going to make it more difficult for governments to spend more in future because of the deterioration in the state of public finances. I happen to think that, generally speaking, there's a lot of exaggerated talk right now about the long-term effects of the pandemic. I don't think that the pandemic is suddenly going to result in the disappearance of globalization or a revolution in working life. I think we'll be surprised at just how rapidly things actually get back to pretty well what they were before the pandemic, even if that's not what should actually happen. The other thing which I think is very specific about the argument I'm putting forward is that it's got nothing whatsoever to do with an expansion of the role of the state. The big increase in spending I'm talking about isn't assumed to be the consequence of progressive forces winning elections. What it's about is powerful external pressures which will force government spending up and which will be felt by governments of all persuasions, conservative, progressive, or whatever. So these are forces which it will be very difficult even for conservative parties to resist, as you can see, for example, in the United Kingdom at present. And Danny, if we could perhaps move on 2 slides to the health spending slide. So what's going to be the number one area of increased spending? In my view, that's going to be health. When we talk about spending of an extra 7% of GDP, as I see it, the lion's share of that is at least 4% of that 7%, is going to be in the area of increased health spending. Now, the reason for this is not going to be population aging or any of a number of other candidates that are often put forward to explain rising health spending. The dominant reason for this is going to be the cost of the expanding technological capabilities of medicine. What I mean by that is the cost of the waves of new and better medical treatments which are going to arrive on the scene in coming decades. We are now in the early stages of a bioscience revolution, a fundamental bioscience revolution, which is in particular generating a flood of precision customized medicines which are they offer huge benefits to citizens in terms of much more effective medical treatment, but they really come at a high cost. And this, in my view, is going to be by far and away the main force which is going to be pushing health spending up in coming decades. Now, population aging will certainly play a role, but the widespread popular notion that population aging has been the main force pushing health spending up in recent decades, and will be what continues to happen in the future, is not only wrong, but it's a view that health economists generally don't accept. For reasons that are explained in my book, it simply is not the case that health spending increases in line with the share of the elderly in the population. So health spending is the biggest ticket item here. And I think this is going to be a particular problem for Switzerland because there are reasons to fear that government health expenditure is going to increase faster in Switzerland than in most other advanced countries. There are two reasons why I say this. The first is that there's going to be enormous pressure for rising government spending on subsidizing health insurance premiums. With health premiums rising, the pressure on governments to subsidize, to pay a larger portion of those premiums is going to increase. Firstly, to ensure that health insurance remains affordable for the great majority of Swiss citizens, but secondly, also because of the political pressure. But I think there's another problem in Switzerland, which is that the disciplines, the controls on the increase in health expenditure are weaker than in many other countries. You've only got to look at the enormous pricing power that pharmaceutical companies have in Switzerland to set excessive prices for new drugs to see the nature of the problem. And of course, the problem goes well beyond that. So, you know, when you're faced with future prospects of rapidly increasing health spending, when you have these additional problem of reasons why the pressure is likely to be felt greater in Switzerland, this seems to me to create very strong pressures for some fundamental reforms to the Swiss health system. So if we move on to the next slide, this brings us to what is obviously a top, probably the number one policy priority for all governments across the world, and that is, of course, dealing with the existential crisis of climate change. This response is going to require policy responses right across the board, new regulatory frameworks. Public expenditure, though, is of course going to be a significant part of this. And in particular, what's going to, where governments are going to spend most is going to be in the government's contribution to what I've called the climate investment effort. We're talking here obviously about investment required to achieve the energy transition to move us towards net zero, but also so-called adaptation investment. That is, for example, investment on climate proofing, infrastructure, on dealing with the consequences of rising temperatures, for example, melting permafrost in the Alps, resulting in more environmental damage. Addressing those sorts of risks is going to cost government a lot. Now, it might be thought, given the magnitude of the challenge, that this is going to be an area where governments would have to spend perhaps even more than in health. But curiously enough, when you look at the available estimates, and I've got to emphasize here that the degree of uncertainty about the spending requirements to tackle climate change is absolutely enormous. We need a lot more work in this area. But the work that's available suggests that the costs to government are likely to be actually a lot less than one might imagine. And if government were to start aggressively now, then probably spending of significantly less than 1% of GDP per year over the next 3 decades would actually be required. But there's I guess, a big area of uncertainty about this, which is just how expansive the role that government ends up taking on in tackling climate change ends up being. If government were to confine its spending mainly to the investment effort in relation to its own services and operations, spending would be quite small. The big issue, though, is to what extent is government also going to take on the costs of the energy transition for businesses and households? In other words, to what extent is it going to subsidize businesses to shift to make the energy transition? To what extent is it going to subsidize households to, for example, move to electric cars? Now, you know, there are very strong economic arguments to say that subsidies are generally not a good instrument for this, that the main burden of the private sector energy transition should not be borne by subsidies, but should be borne by a high carbon tax plus aggressive regulations, for example, to phase out things such as coal power stations. And if that approach with a limited reliance on subsidies was pursued, it would be not only the most efficient approach, but it'd be the approach which would keep government spending down considerably. The problem is, though, that in the real world, it's quite clear that the political resistance to sufficiently high carbon taxes is enormous in many advanced countries. It's just going to be politically impossible to push carbon taxes up to the level that would be required to do this in the best possible way. And that tells me that governments are going to end up relying much more on subsidies than they should, and that this is going to push up the cost of the overall energy transition Shifting on to the next slide, area of population aging more specifically. The next slide shows us the population projections for Switzerland. Danny, just to that next slide. You'll see here we're projected, like other advanced countries, quite rapid increases in the elderly part of the
Marc, I think your connection is slightly unstable. We cannot see you anymore. I guess you'll be back in a few seconds, but right now we can read the slide. Please, everybody, you have a few seconds to figure out what question you want to ask. I think there was a lot of information by now, and certainly it's good to digest. So we have this small break.
Hello.
Hello, welcome back.
Yeah, the usual computer crash here. So population aging. Well, we've already talked about the way in which the impact of population aging on health spending, while it's going to be significant, is going to be less than is widely imagined. But of course, there are two other areas of government spending which are vastly more sensitive to population aging. And the first of those clearly is aged pensions, big issue in Switzerland. If you look across the advanced world, you see that just about everywhere, spending on age pensions is going to increase a lot over the next 2 decades. But if we go beyond that, and the frame of the book is up to 2050, we see a very mixed picture internationally. There are a number of countries, advanced countries, where in fact pension spending is going to either stabilize or fall over that 30-year time frame. The trouble is Switzerland is not one of those countries. And the reason why, of course, age pensions are more of a problem in Switzerland than elsewhere is that the politics of getting sensible age pension reform in this country are so much more difficult. I mean, they're difficult everywhere, but they're particularly difficult in Switzerland for the obvious reason that any half-decent reform is going to be voted down in a referendum. We saw this with Alain Berset's reforms, which were not only modest, but inadequate to deal with the problem, but nevertheless were decisively defeated at the polls. So exactly how Switzerland is going to achieve pension reform to make old age pensions affordable is something I'm not clear on. The other big area which will affect every advanced country is, of course, long-term care, particularly for the elderly population. Now, the reason why long-term care spending is so much more sensitive to population aging than health spending is the extent to which population aging will lead to a big increase in the numbers of people suffering from dementia or other serious long-term incapacity, which will require them to have expensive residential care for significant periods of time. The only way of dealing with this problem is through some system of social insurance. And by that I mean compulsory social insurance, in the same way that health insurance is compulsory in Switzerland. Compulsory social insurance for long-term care can be delivered either through the tax system with government financing it and levying taxes to pay for it, or it can be in the form of compulsory private insurance, in which case government will also end up subsidising a significant portion of it. Either way, this is a problem which faces many countries, including Switzerland, and demands to be dealt with. There are a few countries, such as the Netherlands and Japan, which have already acted in this area. Most other countries still need to deal with the problem. Moving on to the next slide and the area of income support. So I've talked about health. I've talked about long-term care. I've talked about climate change as areas which will affect all countries, all advanced countries around the world, and which together will add at least 7% of government expenditure at least 7% of GDP to government expenditure over the next 3 decades. There are a couple of other areas such as infrastructure, which I could have mentioned, which are big issues in places like the United States, as is seen with the Biden infrastructure campaign. Germany is another example of a country which will have to spend on its dilapidated infrastructure, but this is not true everywhere, and it's certainly not true in Switzerland. So if we set all those areas aside, then it might be said that I'm missing out one other big issue, which is the area of income support for the working age population. Because there are many who say that the future prospects of the labour market are such that we are going to see a growing numbers of people who are in poorly paid work or are permanently unemployed or are in precarious employment, and that governments will be forced to respond to this by greatly increasing income support expenditure. And of course, the big proposal that gets put forward in this context is the proposal of a basic income, a universal basic income, where everybody is paid some sort of living subsidy every month. So I looked carefully at this book, and my view is that, that this is without foundation, that there's a lot of exaggerated talk here about these long-term trends. There is no trend to long-term trend to technological unemployment. It is untrue that we are faced with a long-term trend towards more precarious work and more exclusion from the workforce. It's interesting, this whole thing about precarious work, which has become such a big theme recently. We all know about the Deliveroo workers and others who suffer genuine difficult conditions of precarious employment. But when you look at the overall statistics, you don't see any evidence that precarious employment is a long-term trend facing advanced capitalist societies in general. The same is true about exclusion from the workforce. You know, it's interesting that a lot of the discussion is dominated by the US experience, where there has been increasing exclusion of a large part of the workforce, a growing numbers of inactive people in the workforce. outside the workforce. But this is not true of advanced capitalist societies in general. So my view is that there is no reason to believe that governments will in fact be forced to significantly increase their expenditure on income support over the coming decades. So that leads us to the last slide and some overall conclusions about the prospects which are facing us. As I say, it seems to me that governments all around the advanced world are facing huge long-term spending pressures of a sort which have not been witnessed on this scale in the past, and that faced with these sorts of pressures, there will be only two major choices for them. One is to raise taxes significantly, and the other is to scale back the role of the state, or some combination of those two. I look extensively in the book at the question of whether the situation might be saved by simply achieving a lot more efficiency in government, by cutting waste. And my conclusion is that, yes, there's certainly significant scope for cutting waste in government, improving efficiency, but the idea that this is going to be, that there's so much low-hanging fruit in this area that we can save the day and offset most of this big additional spending pressure is unrealistic. The contribution of efficiency savings is going to be relatively secondary. So that leaves us with taxes or scaling back the state. If you look at countries like the United States, where taxes are low and government services are very poor, where the welfare state is a disgrace, it's quite clear that it's higher taxes that have to do the job. But when you look at other countries at the other end of the spectrum, like France or Denmark, which have much higher tax levels, it's not at all clear to me that voters will support responding to these spending pressures mainly, or let alone wholly, through raising taxes. So this tells me that particularly in those countries, the welfare state is going to come under enormous pressure in the coming decades. Now, as we know, these pressures have been greatly exaggerated by the pandemic, by the fact that in most advanced countries, public debt levels have jumped up astronomically. For the moment, the situation's saved by very low interest rates, but that's not going to continue indefinitely. Switzerland, thank God, is in an exceptional situation here, that its public debt remains low and hasn't actually increased all that much over the pandemic. So that at least means that in this respect, the situation facing this country is significantly better. But it remains the case that these major long-term spending pressures have to be faced. You know, there are some advocates of modern monetary theory and some who preach what they think is Keynesian economics, but isn't really, who seem to think that somehow in the post-austerity era that these pressures on government finances are going to be reduced. But it remains the case that whatever arguments there are for deficits and stimulatory spending as we come out of the pandemic and try and restore our economies, that in the longer term, to run permanently large deficits or to rely indefinitely on central banks is a road to ruin. So tough choices will need to be made. And it's not going to be easy for governments of any political persuasion, left-wing or right-wing. And the big question is, what choices will individual countries make? And in particular, what choices is Switzerland going to make in the longer term, faced with these enormous spending pressures? So Alenka, I think I'll leave it there and pass the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Marc. Fantastic and very sobering indeed. I do hope that our decision makers get a copy of your book and And I mean, there are so many areas which are covered and really in depth. I think this is it's pretty urgent to act. Looks like it. I would just ask one question, because I see that there are a lot of questions already in the chat. What I'm interested in is, what would we need in terms of pension reform if we do the math? Because we're not talking about 65 for women. How far are we from something which would actually make a difference?
Okay, well, I mean, I think the simple reality that I'm sure everybody's aware of is that life expectancy has increased enormously. When these pension systems were introduced, life expectancy at the time of retirement at the age of 60 or 65 was just a few years. Now people live for decades. So it's quite obvious that the main problem is that the retirement age has not increased in line with life expectancy. When we talk about countries moving the retirement age towards 70, this is only realistic. I mean, you either have to do that or you have to cut pension benefits significantly. I find it's very interesting, really. Maybe it's just my gender, but I can't see any case whatsoever for women retiring at a younger age than men. I'm sure there'll be people who want to debate that particular issue, but it just does indicate the difficult politics of this, that in the debate over the Berset reforms, there were many people who, for some reason, confused feminism with the issue of the retirement age for women. I don't see the connection myself. Now, having said all of that, of course, if it were just a question of raising the retirement age in line with life expectancy, the reforms would be technically easy, but it's not quite as simple as that, because we know that life expectancy actually differs depending on whether you do a tough manual job or whether you're a cadre supérieur. And this needs to be taken into account in some way in redesigning the pension system. But I think, at a technical level, what we need to do is pretty clear. People have been investigating pension reform directions for a long time. The problem is not technical, the problem is political.